Well, there's a highly successful book out there, Beneld and the Booze Gang. Jim Marcacci teaming up with the late John Euban on that project, and Marcacci making the rounds, visiting libraries and businesses to talk about this new book that focuses on the organized crime past in Benld and Macoupin County. Now let's join Jim Marcacci on the program.
I understand the reception that this book has received. I can imagine you've just been blown away by the response.
Oh, I sure have. I had no clue. Even after I'd finished the book and published it, I wasn't even thinking about a number one bestseller in any category. And yeah, you're right. It kind of blew me away.
I think the beauty of this is history is about what happened, and I know for other people it's about what may have happened. And the Capone aspect, the mythology, is maybe just as interesting as the fact.
Yeah, you're right. The stories had always been told that Al Capone was a frequent visitor to Benld, and that was the biggest part of the whole story. That, along with Mine Number 5, and there was always that loose attachment that Capone had something to do with the Mine Number 5, and just the stories of what was going on in the streets of Benld back then. But we didn't have any solid proof. We had no idea. We knew that Mine Number 5 was a still, but we had no idea how big it was. And when we started uncovering, when John Euban and I started uncovering the facts behind the myth, we were just amazed. We didn't know if there was enough for a book at first, but once we started digging, we knew we had something amazing.
How much time did you invest in this project? I can imagine there were endless sources, and things I can imagine it gets a little trickier now because you hear from some sources who talk about what they heard from past generations.
Oh, definitely. We're talking about things that happened 100 years ago. And we discovered through interviews with grandchildren of people. Fortunately, John and I were working on a documentary about the Coliseum Ballroom that goes back to around 2010. And we interviewed a couple of people who were around back then. And one of them was George Lacey, who just had a vivid imagination. He was about 90 years old at the time, but he was just sharp as a tack. And he gave us some stories that proved that Capone was in Benld. He may not have been a regular, but he was there checking over his investment. And even in 2010, we didn't know how big of an investment it actually was. But it wasn't until we started in earnest about 8 years ago in doing this book. John, I have to give John credit. He thought there was a book before I did. And when he told me that, we started thinking, we started putting the facts down. We're looking for information in old papers about the Coliseum Ballroom, and we're finding information about a still has been seized by the federal government. A house of ill repute has been closed. All of this happening in Benld. So that's when we discovered we had a book. And then John got sick and couldn't follow through with finishing the book. And when he passed, I told his wife that I would finish the book.
I can imagine fulfilling that legacy has just made this a whole different experience.
It sure has, yeah. John did want it for his legacy. He had talked to me about that on more than one occasion, that he wanted to have his mark made. And although he didn't get to see it, I think he's looking down, and I think he knows. I think he's happy. I think I felt him touch me on the shoulder the other night at the first book signing. It was heartfelt.
Well, that's great stuff, and I think of a book like this. People who are in that Chicago region who have a lot of interest in that history. Have you found following some books purchased from outside the region? Because I can imagine they're fascinated at how Capone and organized crime operated, and the fact that there is so much more downstate than they would have imagined.
Yes, there is a component there. We have, and I've had 2 book signings over at Duds and Benld, and at each of the nights that I was there, I had people come up to me and say they have relatives in Chicago that wanted to buy that either wanted to buy the book or did buy the book because of their conversations with their Benld Gillespie relatives. So yeah, they're excited about it. Yeah. And there's much more to it than the Chicago component, too, which nobody knew about. I would bet money that not a single soul, other than some families that were personally touched by it, had a clue about the involvement of the St. Louis Mafia and the Springfield Mafia. And they were heavily in business in Benld back during the entire Prohibition era. And one was so involved and so much time was spent in Benld that he met his wife in Benld, and he was the head of the St. Louis Mafia, which was at the time the most powerful gang operation in all of St. Louis. And then the Springfield component, the head of the Springfield Mafia got his start in Benld prior to Prohibition. And he had to leave Benld because he murdered somebody. And moved to Springfield, married into the Springfield Mafia family, and eventually became what everybody would refer to him as being as the godfather of the prairie. And so, yeah, there's a lot of facts in this book that just were hidden, buried. And had this book not been written, this information would, I don't think, ever been revealed.
Well, I know it has to be an education, too, for people. I think you talk to the average person, they think Prohibition gets passed in Washington, and like organized crime and the mafia was born the next day. Of course, it didn't work that way. And I know they had their hands on everyday necessities, the grocery world and everything else. And it was a whole different era, and I know everybody had to be incredibly cognizant of not upsetting the apple cart. A little suspicion, hey, is, again, reflecting on law enforcement of the era, not now, but, hey, is that guy on the mafia roster? And if I tell him about something, is he going to go off and tell the wrong person? It was a whole different, it was more than just a history. I guess it was a way of life.
Oh, it was. And there was some cruelty on the part of the mafia. It wasn't all romance. It's the story about the mafia is intriguing and it's captivating. But the people of Benld, they went through a lot of fear. I mean, they were afraid of these people, these bad guys with guns, and they would the mafia would go up and down the streets with their Thompson submachine guns sticking out the window just to frighten the people so that they didn't talk. And they did more than that. They beat people too. So when it started to get close to dark, there weren't any people roaming the streets of Benld, and they didn't talk. That was a popular saying, they didn't talk. The mafia stayed at the Benld Hotel almost off and on during the entire period of Prohibition, from 1920 to 1933. There were always rooms saved for mafia, whether it be Springfield, St. Louis, and occasionally Chicago interests.
So it all coming to an end, to some respects, or as far as out in the open, everything else. Everything I've heard, it was a little bit of cannibalism. They kind of turned on their own. Was that, at least in some places, was that the factor here? I know that the St. Louis Mafia really turned on itself.
Oh, the St. Louis Mafia, you're right, absolutely right. Yeah, they just imploded. But the Springfield Mafia had plans, and they carried them through. They had somebody that was smart enough not to be out in the limelight all the time. They didn't go killing sprees just at random because they knew that would draw attention. That's what happened to the St. Louis Mafia. They just weren't very smart, and they imploded on themselves. But we shouldn't tell this story without mentioning the presence of Dominic Terrell, who was a native resident of Benld. Well, there were no native residents of Benld in 1915. They all moved in, right? Because there was no Benld before 1904. It was located there to be centrally located between three superior coal mines, so that the people in Benld could walk to any one of the three mines. And a fourth one would come in 1916, and the key ingredient, the key individual, I should say, was Dominic Terrell, who was a retailer of groceries. And when Prohibition started, he made sure that he was not only a retailer, but a wholesaler. And he was the person responsible for feeding all of the stills in Macoupin, Montgomery, some of Sangamon County, and probably in the Madison County as well. And he and his brother would receive shipments by the boxcar full in Benld of sugar and yeast. And sugar and yeast made for liquor is different than sugar and yeast that you use in the kitchen. So not everybody could be a wholesaler, because these companies didn't want anybody else knowing what they were doing, because it was a federal offense. But Dominic Terrell was the supplier, and he went to Springfield because the federal government found out who was doing the supplying, and he went to his lawyer. They posted his bond, and he left the lawyer's house and never was seen again until that was in January, and in May his body was found in the Sangamon River. He was killed by the mafia. And in the book we tell we just about know who the persons are that killed him, because the FBI revealed it in a FOIA request. So that's something that never had been known before either. So that's all brand new information. And Dominic Terrell was the same person who built the Coliseum Ballroom in 1924. So he was an entrepreneur, and he was sorely missed when he was killed by the mafia in 1930.
I know things were different. I know when we talk about the narcotics side of things today, when we think of, that's the biggest thing we think of when we think of modern organized crime. And everything seems centralized as far as shipping. Move it up I-55, hide it in the gas tank on a semi. And how different was all of this when, you had 66, when you didn't have the thoroughfare where you could park out and look for suspicious activity?
That's an interesting point to bring up. Route 4, which turned into Route 66, that's the original alignment for Route 66, was the only hard road that went from St. Louis to Chicago. It was the longest hard road in the state of Illinois at the time. And they numbered them in the order in which they put them in. So there were three other hard roads before it, but that was it. It was the fourth one. And that was quite unique for Benld. Benld had Route 4 for delivering the booze. They had Cahokia Creek for the water needed to make the alcohol. And they had a pretty dense population of Italians in Benld. But there were a lot of Croatians, Russians, other nationalities in Benld from Eastern Europe, and they all got along, and a lot of them were involved in it too because there was money to be made. And so I call it the kind of the perfect storm because we had Route 4, we had good water, and we had a population that was needed for operating these and tending these stills. Before we leave our conversation, we should say this too, that the single largest illegal booze operation, distillery, in the United States was in Benld. It was mine number 5. And it was mine number 5 because it was, first of all, it was built to look like a mine, so when they were searching it from the air, they couldn't find it. And secondly, the locals named it mine number 5 because we had superior coal numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4. And the locals tagged this distillery as mine number 5. That's how it's got its name. And then we had several other, what the feds called, monster stills. These were stills that weren't quite as big as mine number 5, but they rivaled the size of mine number 5, and they were all being fed by Dominic Terrell. And the St. Louis and the Springfield mafias were the ones in charge of taking the finished product, and Chicago, more than likely, was the agent that determined where all this booze would go.
The logistics is so different than everything else, but it's one thing to talk to people who had parents during this era or grandparents. I can imagine on occasion when you run into a young person, this stuff must absolutely blow their minds. It's just hard to imagine all of this.
Right. Yeah, it's hard to fathom. I agree. And you were talking about how they hide the drugs. Well, they used to hide the booze in these big trucks, and they'd have fake fruit, bananas in the back, just hanging over the edge, maybe 2 or 3 feet deep, and the rest of the truck was full of 5-gallon tin cans of alcohol, and that's how they got by with delivering this up and down Route 4. Or Route 66 later. So, yeah, they hit it.
We picture the intimidation aspect, but they were indeed very resourceful.
Yes, they were very resourceful. And, to make a distillery appear to be an old mine, and we had probably 24 smaller operating mines in Macoupin County alone. So when they're flying over the area looking for a distillery, all they're seeing are all these little mines, along with the 3 largest mines in the world at the time. Superior's numbers 1, 2, and 3 were 3 of the largest mines in the world. And it was just amazing that it took them 8 years to find the largest distillery of illegal booze in the world. Because it had to be the world, because nobody else had prohibition. Well, Canada did, but to a lesser extent.
I know the interesting thing too that comes to mind. We just picture bad people, but I know with the Depression, people who had to feed their families. Boy, call it make a deal with the devil or whatever. But there were, I imagine, some upstanding people who took on this way of life just to survive because they were tough times, the Depression, what have you.
That's true. That's very true. And prior to the Depression, the Prohibition started in 20, ended in 33. So there were several years of Depression starting in 29. But prior to that, the mines didn't work all the time every year. Sometimes there were lulls where you just didn't go to work. So you had to do something else besides sit in your living room not watching TV because it hadn't been invented yet. So a lot of them resorted to making booze. And even more importantly, Sean, people in Benld and a lot of different communities didn't think Prohibition was good. They thought that booze was a way of life. You know, I know growing up, we always had a bottle of wine on the table at dinner time, and that was just, I didn't drink it, but that was just part of our life. And most people didn't see anything wrong with alcohol. So it was pretty easy to get involved in making illegal booze.
And we talked about the out in the open intimidation and everything else, but I know one of the interesting facts about the mafia, and Al Capone would have his big, kids' charity events and all of that. Is the way they operated in the Chamber of Commerce way too, on the flip side of the coin.
That's true. Yeah, he had his soup kitchens. He did a lot of the good things for a lot of good people. For a lot of people, in Benld, I know of one story that's been told more than once, and from reliable sources, that the mafiosi who were spending their time in Benld a lot would go to the baseball games, the kids' baseball games, and they would hand out money so that these kids could have ball gloves and bats and home plates, things like that necessary for playing baseball. So they were generous in that way. And not all of them were that, running up and down Main Street with guns blazing. They had some of them were pretty good people too. And they were just making a living themselves.
The speakeasy thing is just fascinating because some were, I guess, more public than others, but I can imagine there are a number of buildings where people don't realize somewhere before a renovation here and there, or a couple of other changes in a building, there was a speakeasy within their walls.
Oh, you're absolutely right. And there were individuals' homes that would be used their front room would be used for a bar during Prohibition. So anywhere from a building, a basement in a building, to somebody's home. And all the locals knew about it, actually the police in Benld during most of Prohibition said if the feds want to capture all of this illegal booze operations, they can do it themselves. Nick Bellini, who was the chief of police in Benld, was quoted in a newspaper as saying that. So they weren't out looking for him. One of the neat expressions that I came across in doing my research, and I should have put it in the book, but I didn't, was, Prohibition's not too bad. The only thing worse is no alcohol at all.